Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Postdoctoral Association's 2023 International Equity Summit. I'm Tom Kimbis. I'm Executive Director and CEO of the NPA. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Thank you for coming. If you're unfamiliar with the NPA, we are the national voice of the postdoctoral community. We're a charitable and educational organization, and we're made up of more than 20,000 individual members, as well as educational institutions across the country. And we're very proud to present this third annual Equity Summit, following up on our 2021 Gender Equity Summit and last year's Race and Ethnicity Equity Summit. I'd really like to thank my co-chair in helping lead this event, Dr. Tanya Pais. She's a postdoctoral research associate in the Psychology and Biobehavioral Sciences Department at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. She's also an international officer of the NPA. She's doing a ton for us. Thank you, Tanya. Today, postdocs across the country provide innovation, creativity, and leadership to our society's most difficult issues across all disciplines of science and research. The postdoctoral story is a dynamic one, and at the NPA, we're fortunate enough to work alongside thousands of members, dozens of partner organizations, key government agencies who are really dedicated to making positive change in the postdoc experience. It's a great time to be a postdoc, to be involved with what I hope will be looked back upon as a period of major improvement to the postdoc position. For our postdocs out there, however, we know that not everyone's journey is the same, not all the challenges, not all the burdens, and that no one can do justice to each one of your individual stories and pathways as a postdoc. But we can work to identify some of the difficulties and the opportunities that many of you share. At the NPA, we work to advance the postdoc experience, to promote the correct policies and practices, share the newest information, so that the postdoc community is increasingly inclusive, and so that your experiences are positive ones. In fact, the NPA strategic plan highlights diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as one of its four core pillars for action and activity. So today, we're going to dive into issues facing one of our long underrepresented communities, international postdocs. They're sometimes lost in the whole EIB discussion. International researchers now make up a majority of the US postdoc population, with 58% of the nation's postdocs coming from outside the US. But the burdens faced by international postdocs are even more complicated than those who work as postdocs today from domestic origins. And we saw this clearly in the data that was shared by our members in the NPA Needs Assessment Report, which we put out earlier this year. And that extra burden, the quote, international postdoc tax, as Doctors Paula Cepeda and Natalie Trinetz refer to it, and we'll speak to it today in our fourth session. It's real, and it causes the most significant impact on the personal and professional lives of postdocs who face it, according to our members. So we launched this summit and discussions throughout 2023 at the NPA around international postdocs. We wanted to advance the conversation around the difficult issues that they face, and note that these are not critical only to the success of international postdocs, but to the entire postdoctoral communities and the full research enterprise that they support. The summit is a series of discussions, but it's intended to do more than just generate online talk. We want to stimulate ideas. It's designed to cultivate discussions, take back to your home communities and institutions, and best of all, to inspire action by both individuals and institutions to improve the postdoc experience for all. Remember that the NPA covers all disciplines from STEM to social sciences and the humanities. So if one of our case studies we talk about today covers just one discipline, it's intended to benefit us all. I wanted to thank and acknowledge our two core sponsors of today's summit and ask that you get to know them: the American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics, or ASPET, which is hosting its 2024 annual meeting next May in the Washington, D.C. region. Abstract submissions are open, with many travel awards and poster competition opportunities available for early career scientists, including postdocs. And Frank and Delaney Immigration Law, which offers a wide range of services tailored to the needs of employers and individuals in dealing with specific visa and immigration questions, such as those we're dealing with today. They've been longtime supporters of the NPA and a trusted voice in the postdoc community for immigration law. Thank both of these organizations. Also, thanks to our incredible lineup of panelists and moderators today from across the country, coming from academia, nonprofit organizations, and from industry members for sharing their voices in this important discussion. Lastly, a special thanks to our incredible international officers at the NPA who work with these critical issues on a daily basis. Each one of those 4 panels you're going to hear today will cover one aspect of the international experience. You may recall that during National Postdoc Appreciation Week, the NPA held a national broadcast session where we spoke with Deputy Assistant Secretary Julie Stuft from the State Department, who mentioned in response to several questions from the audience that, well, those are the answers are in the hands of USCIS. The other half of the equation of international laws and regulations that affect the postdoctoral experience for internationals. And you'll hear some of that from Doug Rand from the USCIS momentarily. Our second panel is going to dive into the tough issues of health and wellness for all postdocs, with a particular focus on the challenges faced by internationals. Third, we'll explore some of the concepts of DEIB and how international postdocs are included, or sometimes not, in those discussions. And last, our final panel focuses on finding solutions, practical issues and actions that can be taken at institutions across the country to build a better postdoc experience. So I encourage you to participate, not just listen, in all 4. Together, you're going to see some common threads develop throughout the day. Before turning to our first session, a couple of housekeeping notes for you. As a reminder, you have to log into each panel separately using that unique Zoom link that was provided in your calendar invite when you registered. Panels will begin at the start of the hour and end at 50 minutes past the hour, giving you a 10-minute break in between each panel. They're intended to be conversations, and although your mics and cameras are off for this session in order to allow our proper Zoom bandwidth, please engage by using the chat function to keep the conversation going among participants. Or if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom browser. This is being recorded. It will be available on the NPA website in coming days. Additional material is also available in the NPA resource library that will help advance this conversation and related ones. So really encourage you to check out those resources that we have available to you for free in our library. Note that unless otherwise indicated, speakers are here as individuals rather than representatives of their institutions, and they're going to be sharing both personal and professional experiences. We've also found that some content during our equity summits does present information that can be difficult to speak about, to think about, to act on. They're not easy topics. So to the extent you need to, feel free to reach out to your own institutions for support, whether that's an international office, a PDO office, or your PDA. We chose to make this event free to everybody to spread the word as widely as possible, regardless of whether you're an NPA member or not. However, if you're not a member, it's important and most likely free if you're an individual, if you'd like to join. All postdocs, students, faculty, and staff of an organizational member of the NPA, an institutional member like an academic institution, can sign up for a free individual membership. You'll have access to our educational programming, networking opportunities throughout the year, as well as our NPA resources. And you can gain leadership experience by serving as a volunteer on one of our committees or task forces. So that's easy to join. Lastly, our 2024 NPA Annual Conference, as you see on your screen, is open for registration. Please come and join us in Seattle. We're going to be there on March 15th and 16th. We'd love to see you. It's the premier professional education and networking event for postdocs in the U.S. If you'd like to take advantage of our early bird rate for registration, that goes through December 15th, and you can sign up as a member to get that rate. So do pay attention to that date, in particular, because we're a month earlier with our conference next year than we were this past spring in Philadelphia. In April, we saw record attendance. So please make sure to register early. Sessions will be posted soon on our website after a tremendous turnout of abstract submissions. Thank you to so many of you who submitted abstracts. That was an amazing show, and we're going to be proud to present so many interesting components during our sessions in Seattle. There's also the opportunity to sponsor this event in a variety of different ways. You can see the 2024 annual conference prospectus linked in the chat. So enough about background. We appreciate your being here, and I'm happy to introduce our first speaker and moderator of the first panel. We're thrilled to have Doug Rand with us today as our keynote speaker. Doug is Senior Advisor to the Director of USCIS. Previously, he served as a Senior Fellow at the Federation of American Scientists, working in the intersection of immigration policy and artificial intelligence in advancing the nation's national security and economic growth. He's also served in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP, with a portfolio spanning inclusive high growth and entrepreneurship, access to capital, clean energy innovation, and high skill immigration. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and the Yale School of Management, and he's received his master's and undergraduate degrees from Harvard, where he studied evolutionary biology. And thanks to our moderator today, Brendan Delaney, who's a partner attorney at Frank and Delaney Immigration. He's a native of Northern Ireland, and Brendan received his law degree at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. So note to yourselves, probably the only time in MPA you'll have 3 attorneys speaking at the same time. That was back in January of 2009. Focusing on the representation of foreign-born nationals and U.S. employers with their U.S. immigration matters, Brendan's work includes an emphasis on extraordinary ability and national interest waiver cases, as well as EB-1B, PERM, J waivers, H-1B, and O&P visa applications. Brendan works extensively with scientists, researchers, physicians, and other professionals, as well as organizations and employers in both academia and industry, assisting with their temporary and permanent visa applications on a company, individual, institutional basis. So Doug and Brendan, thank you for being here today. And Doug, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for the honor of speaking with you today. Just speaking personally for a moment, the role of postdoc in society is something I feel closer to maybe than the average person who may be addressing you. My sister, after getting her PhD, was a postdoc at University of Wisconsin for a number of years, a number of formative years, and I am a PhD dropout. So I have nothing but immense respect for everyone in the postdoc community who has gone farther than I was able to, and I just, both personally and professionally, I think it's self-evident that postdocs are engaged in some of the most important work in the country, if not the world. Continuing every day to expand the frontiers of human knowledge, whether it's in the science, social sciences, or humanities. So I wanted to kind of emphasize a couple of things at the outset before we go to questions, which I'm eager to leave a lot of time for. First, it sounds like you already talked to my colleague at the State Department, Julie Stuff, which is terrific. The way I kind of think about the difference between the Department of State and my agency, which is part of Department of Homeland Security, is that the State Department's job is to run consulates and decide who gets a visa stamp in their passport and can get on a plane and come here, consistent with the law, of course. USCIS is, our bread and butter is really adjudicating applications for immigration services for people with a nexus already in the United States. So once you're here, if you need a change of status, or if you're adjusting status to permanent residency, or if we hope you ultimately become a U.S. citizen and applying for naturalization, applying for work permits, all those things, that's USCIS. We do about 10 million transactions a year for everything from work permits to green cards to naturalization to changes of status. And I find it to be an incredible privilege working here, given our mission, which is officially to uphold America's promise as a nation of welcome and possibility with fairness, integrity, and respect for all we serve. And we know that we serve many, if not all of you, at various points in your journey, and we hope to do that better and better. So in terms of kind of, what's new, both on the upside and continuing challenges, I'd be remiss if I didn't start by saying, just acknowledging the reality that our immigration laws haven't really changed materially in over 30 years. I mean, the last big overhaul was in 1990, which was a very different country, a different economy, much smaller country, both economically and population wise. And so we have to live within those constraints. And so the name of the game as a policymaker, I think, I'm talking about, the entire executive branch here and the entire Biden administration, is how do we make the immigration system work better, faster, and more transparently for everybody within the constraints and laws set out by Congress. And so that could mean issuing a regulation under congressional authority. That could mean providing sub-regulatory guidance for people like Brendan and his clients. That can sometimes mean just being more transparent in our public materials so that people without consulting a lawyer can understand what their options are. And so I just wanted to run down what I hope you will also perceive as recent progress before we go to questions. So in the beginning of last year, the White House announced a suite of new efforts to attract and retain global science and engineering talent. And that included a number of things. For our part at USCIS, we issued some new policy guidance that we hoped would clarify eligibility for the O1 visa, which is for individuals of extraordinary ability, and also for the EB2 green card with a national interest waiver, which is a more streamlined way that allows people to self-petition for a green card if they have an advanced degree or can demonstrate exceptional ability. Our hypothesis at the time was we believed that these are valid pathways that for a long time had been too intimidating, that whether intentionally or just through benign neglect, we allowed to be framed more rigidly than they really are, and that there were lots of people who are eligible for these pathways out there, including postdocs, who would be applying but for this intimidation factor. That the O1 is often called the genius visa. It's for Nobel laureates. That's true. Nobel laureates are eligible, but you don't have to be a Nobel laureate. I mean, there's some wiggle room between, the sphere of extraordinary ability is larger than just Nobel laureates and Olympic medalists. So we put out that guidance, and I'm happy to say that I think that hypothesis has been validated over the past couple of years. We've seen a lot more applicants. We have seen no major changes in our approval rate, which says to me is good early evidence that there really are a lot more people who have been eligible and who are now submitting, very compelling applications for these pathways. So consistent with that, just within the last month, we issued yet another policy update with clarity on the EB1 green card for individuals of extraordinary ability. And again, the point here is just to say, look, let's show you in unprecedented detail exactly what we're looking for in terms of the criteria to demonstrate your eligibility. So that's been a promising set of developments. We also issued just in the last couple of weeks a proposed regulation to modernize the H-1B program, which is probably relevant for many of you. I won't get into it now unless there's follow-up questions in terms of nitty-gritty details, but it's out there for anyone to read. We encourage public comments to help us craft the final rule. Public comment period is open until December 22nd. We really do read every single comment and take them into account in crafting the final rule. But I mean, basically, this rule would seek to improve the integrity of the H-1B system so that we see legitimate employers sponsoring legitimate employees, would also provide a lot more clarity for entrepreneurs to use the program, and a lot more clarity for which employers count as cap exempt, including universities and their affiliates. That's among a number of other reforms we're seeking to make. And then finally, the hot off the press is just a week ago Monday, the White House issued an extensive executive order on artificial intelligence, which, in addition to making progress on how the government will deploy AI, how we'll ensure privacy and equity, and avoid the harms of certain AI applications. There is a section on attracting and retaining global talent in AI and related fields, which is a pretty broad category that includes most STEM fields. And it's worth looking at that in that it kind of, I think, sets the stage for at least the next year or beyond in terms of what the president is directing, not only my agency, but also the Department of State and the Department of Labor and others to do to lay out the road in that. The last thing I'll say is, we've also tried to be more transparent about what the pathways are. So I'm going to post in the chat some resources that we published recently that are, again, supposed to be for non-lawyers. Like, here are all of the temporary visa and permanent green card pathways for STEM professionals, which I think, I know this audience isn't all STEM postdocs, but I think a lot of this is relevant for social sciences and humanities as well. And then another one for entrepreneurs. And even though I'm not the State Department, the last thing I want to add is that our colleagues at State, I think, are making tremendous progress on modernizing J1 options for through their early career STEM initiative, which is basically a way to encourage employers, not just in academia, but also in the private sector, to hire J1 holders. So I will post that right now, and I'll turn it over to Brendan.
Thank you, Doug. So firstly, I would just like to say thank you so much for attending here today and giving us your insight. It's hugely valuable, I think, to hear from USCIS as the source for the information that you communicated and conveyed today to the audience. And I really, again, on behalf of the MPA and all attendees, I thank you for that. USCIS gets a little bit of a bad rap at times, and it is challenging. So I just want to go back and look at some of the positives that you sort of conveyed and communicated in your chat there. I think for a number of years, STEM applicants and postdocs had this challenge over, well, there's the talk about it being important to US society, important to the US economy. So the fact that over the past year and a half, these executive orders and the guidance seems to have brought STEM to the forefront of USCIS policy. I mean, is that a fair statement and assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a long story. I don't think it necessarily begins with the Biden administration. And when I was working in the Obama Office of Science and Technology Policy, I think we made some big strides in terms of things like allowing the spouses of H-1B workers to have their own work authorization, strengthening the OPT STEM program for university graduates. So I think that there's always more progress to be made, but I think this administration is really doubling down.
Excellent. I'm going to hop on to a couple of questions here. I'm seeing one or two come up in the Q&A, but just before I get to them, I just want to piggyback on something that you mentioned about USCIS actually updating their site to be perhaps more informative and providing a better maybe information for people going there. So when we look out in the big bad world, there's a lot of information out there. People talk to each other. There's forums, there's friends, there's colleagues, and I think sometimes there's not great information that gets sort of passed around. So what would you maybe be able to say about where is the best place to go? Where is a good source to sort of get good solid information? I know you touched a little bit on how USCIS were updating their own site in that regard.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's the .gov websites that are the source of truth. Unfortunately, they're not always easy to read, and they're not always as comprehensive. And I'll give, but on the bright side, I think we're very, very willing, certainly at USCIS, to hear from stakeholders about what is unclear, and do what we can to clarify it. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I think are going to sound really obvious, but I think are hopefully helpful in that regard. So, when the tech industry started doing major layoffs a little over a year ago, we started seeing news stories saying that, oh my gosh, people who are on H-1B and other statuses, if they get laid off, they only have 60 days to find a new job, or they have to go home. And that's not actually true. I mean, it is based on something that is formally true in the regulations, which is that your status will expire within 60 days, but your lawful presence, which is a distinct thing, can continue until you get the next job. And so, I think that caused a lot of panic and harm, and was really hard to explain in all its intricacies. So we put up this resource that I'm posting in the chat, and then we updated it a couple of times. We can't grab everyone by the lapels and say read this, but we hope that it's provided some more certainty and stability for people in a world where, yeah, social media is kind of, you never know what you're going to get. But here we say very clearly, like, you can maintain lawful presence while your application for a different status is pending. You can look for a job while you're on a B visa, as long as you don't actually work. Like, things that were like well known within the agency, but not necessarily something we'd put out in a practice guide for lawyers or for the public. So whenever there's an opportunity for us to do that, I'm certainly all ears. I think it's a muscle we need to keep exercising. To, it's not a regulation, it's not a policy manual update, it's literally just web content. But I think, I don't know, my impression is it can make a difference, and so you should encourage us to do more of this.
Well, I would actually, for purposes of the audience today, I would just really take stock of what A, Doug just said, and B, what he just posted there, because it is an excellent resource. And, listen, for better or for worse, in the current and modern world, there's a lot of information that gets bandied around, forums, social media, etc. And I think, going to the source, and again, Doug, I would totally agree that from my own perspective, what I've seen that USCIS communicates, and certainly that example that you gave, is front and center to that. So again, that's an excellent resource, I suppose, for people in the audience today to go and see and harness. So another, I'm seeing, so one in the Q&A, and I think this is an interesting question on the H-1B standpoint. So over the years, when we look at the prevailing wage issue for H-1Bs, and obviously geographically, it's very different, but positionally, it's a little different. So when certain institutions or in industry, if a company or a group wanted to hire a postdoc, question, is there any discussion or potentially any traction about creating an SOC code or a title that would, encompass postdocs rather than sort of research scientists, biological research, or how does that fit in? And is there maybe anything there?
I think that's a really interesting point. I don't want to overpromise in terms of what's possible. Just blurt out my first impressions, but I would say, like, SFD codes, of course, are controlled by the Department of Labor, but I don't want to say therefore it's not our problem. I would say that now is a really opportune time to make that point in our H-1B rulemaking context, right? I mean, like, the door's open until December 22nd for any and all comments relevant to the H-1B program. And so it would be worthwhile for your organization or for any individuals to submit comments, identifying the problem, proposing solutions. And I can't promise that we'll, do everything immediately or ever. But it is part of the official record. And I've seen this time and again, like, it is extraordinary how seriously policymakers take these comments. I mean, we have to, it's a matter of law. It's part of the, it's part of how Congress designed the administrative rulemaking process. And so I'll just make another plug for it. It's, I think in the popular imagination, it's all about, Congress passing the law and, like, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, but, like, every day like you can call your member of Congress, and good luck to you. Like that does get logged. I mean, it counts for something. But an agency rule is also law, and we are compelled to read every single idea that comes our way. It is like mandatory crowdsourcing of ideas. So I definitely encourage everyone to use your big brains and tell us what we need to know.
Yeah, and just again to reiterate to the audience, so there's comments upon modernizing the H-1B program open. So we'll see if we can get that link perhaps, or I know Tom and look at it, and if it's something that you feel can give you traction, that can benefit, make the comments. The government's going to read it. Let's see where this goes. So we've got one here in the Q&A, and I'm going to sort of piggyback this together with a note that I have on my own end. It's about the visa bulletin. So obviously there's a finite number of employment-based green cards issued each year. I think it's 140,000 that are sort of divvied up between different employment-based categories: EB1, EB2, EB3, EB4, EB5, and no one country or countries can obtain more than, I think it's 7% of the quota, which has led to obvious significant backlogs for India and to a lesser extent China. However, over the past number of months, and as we move into this upcoming fiscal year that just started on October 1st, we've seen more backlogs and retrogression for the EB2 category for all other countries than we have seen in previous years. So people are maybe getting a little bit more anxious about how they're going to be able to navigate. And obviously, caveat for everybody in the audience today, the visa bulletin, unless Doug wants to correct me, is mostly a State Department issue. They get data from USCIS, I believe, but they then publish it, so it's State Department. But with that said, do you have any sort of thoughts or insight as to how that may play out, maybe in the next quarter or for the upcoming fiscal year?
Thank you, Brennan. I actually prepared remarks on this because I suspected we get this question, and I want to be very precise. But one thing I will say, just as a general matter, is, and it's something I didn't really appreciate fully until I was back on the inside at this agency, is that Congress has basically, in 1990, when it provided for how many numbers go to which categories within 140,000, and how does the 7% country cap work, and how do things fall down and cross over and spill across, and all that. It's basically an algorithm. I mean, Congress has basically stipulated an algorithm. And our job is, along with the State Department, is to follow that algorithm in good faith based on projected demand and actual prior petitions and applications. Like, that's it. It's not really it's not like, unlike say like the H-1B system, where it's like, Congress sketched out the basic contours and we can fill them in and reform them and interpret them, right? I mean, the rules of green card allocation are much harder and numerical and kind of ironclad. And so a lot of what I think is causing all of this discomfort is inevitable, unfortunately. It's that Congress set the supply of green cards very low 33 years ago, and demand keeps growing. And demand from India and China certainly has outstripped supply, because those bottlenecks are even smaller thanks to Congress. But for people from any other countries in the rest of the world, that demand is starting to outstrip supply. In addition, so because again, it's 140,000, but really less, because EB4 is a mishmash of categories that aren't necessarily employment based, and EB5 is really for investors, not employers. So it's even a smaller number. Also, about half go to spouses and children, and then you have the 7% bottleneck on top of that. So it really is, a number of different cues that Congress has mandated, and we don't really have wiggle room. We just try to match, supply. We try to make sure that everyone's going through those small apertures in the proper order as laid out by Congress. So getting to the meat of your question, so this fiscal year, which began on October 1st, USCIS and Department of State, we began the year with somewhat more pending inventory of green card applications for EB2 rest of world, that is all countries other than India and China, than the estimated number of visas available for them. So that kind of leads to the cutoff dates you see in the visa bulletin. We also began the fiscal year with significantly more pending inventory for EB2 India than the estimated number of visas available. The same was not true to the same extent for EB2 China. In general, the dates for filing in the October visa bulletin reflect reasonable preliminary estimates of where the final action dates may reach during the upcoming fiscal year 24. Though the actual movement of the dates depends on a variety of factors. Again, all outlined by Congress, not made up by us. We began the fiscal year with significantly more pending inventory for EB1 India than the estimated number of visas available. Possible forward movement or retrogression of the India EB1 final action date is heavily dependent on factors outside of agency control or our ability to predict, such as the continued upgrade filings from non-citizens with older EB2 and EB3 priority dates, as well as application volumes from the rest of the world. Finally, I would say that we began the fiscal year with somewhat more pending inventory in EB1 China than the estimated number of visas available for those applicants. But we don't see the same upgrade trend as with India and rest of world. So we don't expect the same volatility in those in the dates. So I hope that was kind of a deep dive. That's the kind of thing we're hoping to be more and more transparent about. Because I know people want to be able to plan their lives and they want to have certainty. And the fact is, like, while there's no 100% certainty because we can't predict the future, we try to in good faith, with the data we have. And so we're actually planning to release a lot more data than we have in the past, relatively soon. And would love everyone's feedback on that once that's public.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was very insightful. And actually, just perhaps I'll speak to the audience a little bit, and any individuals that are here. It's the data and the numbers are the numbers, as you pointed out, and so therefore, I think for people to prepare ahead of time, and there are going to be potentially more challenges in maintaining non-immigrant status, the potential inability to adjust as quickly as years pass. So these are all sort of things to sort of take stock of potentially ahead of time, prepare yourself and all the rest of it, because as Doug pointed out, the numbers are the numbers, and the data will lead USCIS in the direction that it will. So we had a couple of questions. I don't know if you see them in the Q&A about J1s. I don't know if you want to comment upon that. It's about the waiver of the 2-year home residence requirement upon structuring a personal statement. I would probably see that, assuming that's a no objection waiver, that would be more of a State Department issue, but there are resources that people can look at, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would encourage MPA to email me a roundup of any questions we don't address on this conference, and I'm happy to try to track those down. But I don't want to speak off the cuff on things that I might flood. I will say that we, for our part at USCIS, I mean, we do have, it's not 100% a State Department matter because we adjudicate, eligibility to some extent. And so, especially, when people are changing status. So we did put out our first detailed policy manual update on J1 several months ago, and then more recently we did another update about the home residency requirement for people in emergent circumstances who might not be able to return home, which unfortunately is very timely. I mean, there's a number of conflicts and other issues in the world that might prevent someone from fulfilling their home residency requirement, and we wanted to make very clear how we accommodate them. So I'll find the link to that and encourage people to take it.
Great, thank you. We're sort of coming up to our last few minutes here before we start wrapping this session up. So I've got a couple of other maybe questions or potential small topics that maybe you could just speak to or address quickly. I think that as you alluded to earlier, people like to plan. I mean, we always like to plan our lives, and obviously when you're navigating the US immigration journey, On one hand, you're doing your research, you're a postdoc, but over here you're trying to sort of work out the immigration side of things, and maybe you file a green card application, and your friend or your colleague files a green card application, and theirs gets adjudicated in 4 months, and yours is waiting for 9. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of frustration when we see or when we gauge inconsistent timelines. Is there, and I think, to be fair, you pointed out that USCIS gets 10 million transactions a year. And I think people also have to remember that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, but USCIS are a fee-funded agency rather than sort of being given their funding or budget from Congress. So things are restricted in that regard. But, can we sort of look at maybe having a more consistent timeline of adjudications? It can be a little frustrating sometimes.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I think we have a lot more information on that FAQ for employment base that I posted earlier, but I will say a lot of this is kind of, I think we're moving in the right direction here. There was a time when there were, a great deal more, the higher variance rate in terms of processing times, but since partway through fiscal year 2022 to now, all adjustment of status applications in the EB1, EB2, and EB3 categories, with limited exceptions, are all adjudicated by the field operations director. They're not being done by the service centers anymore. So even though, my standard answer will be, in any event, all petitions and applications are adjudicated, fairly and, based on the facts of each case. But just kind of like as an extra, I think, recent development, our field operations director had accounted for like over 99% of our approvals of adjustment of status applications last fiscal year. And so the Texas and Nebraska service centers are really only minor participants these days. So I feel like that question may have, been based on some bad memories of how things used to be. But I would hope that variance is a lot lower.
And actually, I'm just going to piggyback on that a little bit, because and again, for the audience, in years past, there would have been a number of situations whereby an employment-based application or family-based application would be required to be interviewed at the local center. And I think it is fair to say that there has been a lot more streamlining of the finalization and final processing of green card applications. So I think kudos has to be given in that regard. And also, sort of with that being said, the ability for people to simply have the field offices finalize their applications and issue green cards has streamlined the process. And I have to give kudos to USCIS there. Last year, my understanding is, and I saw a lot of it, this is around August and September of 2022, you guys really made a push to actually finish up and finalize I-485 adjustment of status applications, which led to a significant number of pending I-485s. Now, again, this was last fiscal year, but I think you have to give credit, and again, to the agency for getting through that last year.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, Brennan. Again, not to be too self-congratulatory, but it is true, and I think it's relevant for this audience, because in case it wasn't obvious, like, it is official policy of the United States, and I think shared by most of the American people, that if you are studying here and working here as a postdoc from another country, if you want to stay and, set down roots and ultimately become American, we want to roll out the welcome mat for you. And it might not feel that way every day because of all of the, kind of overhang, and I would describe it as like technical debt of laws that haven't changed in too long. But we're doing our best. Or, I shouldn't say we're doing our best. We could always do better. But we aim to be constantly improving. And so, something that happened that kind of had winners and losers after the pandemic or during the pandemic is that, just again, the way Congress created this algorithm, there's, in addition to the 140,000 employment-based green card numbers every year, there's 226,000 with family members of U.S. citizens and permanent residents. Now, that doesn't include spouses, children, and parents of U.S. citizens. There's no cap on those, but for other adult children, siblings, folks like that. any of those numbers that don't get worked in a given fiscal year, poof, the next year they go to the employment side, and any that don't get worked in the employment side in a given year, poof, they disappear and are lost. So because of the pandemic, consulates around the world closed. Most of the family-based applicants are abroad. A bunch of numbers didn't get used. They suddenly became available for employment-based. We suddenly had double the number of employment-based to do because they're mostly here in the United States already. So it's basically this giant transfer of work from the State Department to USCIS. And the first year, which was 2021, which was like, you know, during a presidential transition year, we didn't make it. We processed 50% more than a normal year, but we didn't. We left a bunch on the table, and that was not ideal, obviously. But in 2022 and 2023, we utilized every single number, and so for 2 years running, employment-based immigrant visa applicants, were twice as likely to get to the front of the line, and many more than twice as likely for Indian and Chinese applicants. We're going to come out with a progress report, hopefully in the next month or so, that shows exactly the numbers I'm talking about. But that was all at the expense of family-based, unfortunately. But it was a kind of once in a generation accelerant for people waiting a long time in the family-based screen program.
So thank you for that. That sort of, and we're going to end on that positive note. I think that as of last year and moving forward, and I hope that this session, that Doug's speech, that Doug's notes earlier, the answers to the questions, sort of give you guys a sense of what is sort of going on behind the scenes a little bit. It certainly was very insightful for me, and I thank you personally for that. And I trust that it was informative for everyone. It conveyed that this is not easy on both sides of the coin, So it's 1:50. We're going to wrap it up with that. I'm going to say absolutely thank you so much again, Doug, for being part of this. It was a pleasure from my own perspective, moderating, listening to you, asking the questions. So thank you for that. For everybody in attendance, I believe there's link to the next panel is in the chat. So you would use that, as Tom said at the outset. And, please engage and continue to attend today's sessions. It's a great event. The MPA's doing fantastic, and, keep doing what you're doing, everybody. And thanks again, Doug.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Tom. And thanks to everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.